The land had been abandoned for 11 years. Everyone in the border village of Harrowfield knew it. The stretch of blackened farmland beyond the broken stone well, where wheat once grew tall before the last war rolled through like wildfire. The farmhouse had burned first. The barn followed. The family who owned it fled east and never returned. Since then, nothing had taken root there. Nothing except weeds. And then, one morning at the end of winter, smoke rose from the chimney. It was thin at first, a cautious thread curling into gray sky, but it was unmistakable. By midday, 3 villagers had ridden past the edge of the ruined property, pretending to inspect fence lines while openly staring at the figure moving across the field. He was tall, broad-shouldered, green-skinned, an orc. He worked without armor. No banners, no weapons strapped across his back, just a shovel. The first fence post he repaired leaned crookedly at the edge of the property line. He dug the hole deeper than necessary, packed the soil firm with slow, deliberate pressure, and tied the salvaged wire carefully along its length. He did not look toward the road. He did not acknowledge the stairs. He simply worked. His name was Therek, and he had not come to conquer anything. He had come because there was nowhere left to go. Weeks earlier, he had crossed the border under cover of fog, not as part of a raiding party, not under command of any war chief. His homeland beyond the northern ridge had fallen into chaos after clan conflicts fractured what remained of their territory. Crops burned, leadership splintered, refugees scattered in every direction. Therek carried only a pack and a rusted hoe strapped to his back. He had walked until the land changed from charred rock to fertile soil, and then further, until he found land no one claimed. Or rather, land no one wanted anymore. The farmhouse roof had collapsed inward years ago. He had spent the first 2 nights clearing debris in silence, dragging charred beams aside, and rebuilding only one small room within the stone foundation. He patched the chimney with mud and scavenged timber. He slept on straw beneath a half-finished ceiling while wind cut through open gaps. He did not expect comfort. He expected work. On the 3rd morning, he found the old well still held water. That decided everything. Now, as late winter frost softened into early thaw, Therek stood in the center of what had once been a wheat field and turned the soil for the first time in over a decade. The ground resisted, not because it was barren, because it had been left alone too long. He drove the hoe into it again, and again, and again. Each strike echoed faintly across the valley. From the road, a child pointed. "Why is he doing that?" she asked her mother. "Because he thinks it's his," the mother muttered. The father shook his head. "No one's worked that land since the war. No one's dared," the mother corrected. Fear lingered like frost in Harrowfield. Orcs had marched through these fields once. They had burned supply stores. They had taken livestock. The memory did not fade easily. So when villagers passed by and saw one of them now rebuilding fence lines and digging furrows where ash once lay thick, they did not see a farmer. They saw a reminder. Therek felt their eyes often. He did not blame them. He did not call out greetings. He did not attempt explanation. He simply worked from sunrise until dusk, hands blistering against worn tools, shoulders aching beneath steady labor. He cleared stones first, then charred roots, then weeds that had grown wild in neglect. On the 5th day, he planted seeds. Barley, hardier than wheat, easier to coax from wounded soil. He knelt as he pressed them into the earth, covering each with care. The land did not belong to him by law. He knew that. He carried no permit, no writ of ownership. But the land had been empty for 11 years, and hunger did not respect borders. That evening, as the sun dipped low beyond Harrowfield, Therek stood at the edge of his newly turned field and looked toward the distant outline of the village. He did not see welcome. He did not see threat. He saw smoke rising from human chimneys, thin and steady. He understood that kind of smoke. It meant survival. He turned back toward the ruined farmhouse, repaired just enough to shelter one man. Tomorrow he would repair the barn frame. The day after, the fence on the western edge. He did not know how long he would be allowed to remain. He did not know whether soldiers would eventually come. He knew only this. The land had been silent for 11 years. And now, under his hands, it was breathing again. Spring arrived slowly in Harrowfield, as if uncertain it was welcome. The frost receded in stubborn patches, clinging to shaded corners of the abandoned farm even as green began pushing through thawed soil. From the village road, people watched more openly now. Therek no longer pretended not to notice. He had repaired half the outer fence by the time the first real rain fell. He worked without rush, reinforcing beams with salvaged timber, replacing warped boards with straight cuts from fallen trees he dragged from the treeline himself. No magic, no shortcuts, just labor. He spoke little. When he did, it was to the land. Low murmurs in Orcish as he tested soil between his fingers. Short, sharp exhalations when stones resisted removal. Quiet thanks when water rose clean from the well bucket. The barley had begun to sprout. Tiny green shoots pierced through blackened earth like fragile declarations. That unsettled the village more than his presence had. It shouldn't grow there, old Merrick muttered at the tavern. That soil's cursed. It's not cursed, replied Jorin the miller. It's neglected. Same thing, Merrick snapped. But even he rode past the field twice that week, slowing his horse just enough to see the lines of green stretching evenly across the ground. Therek caught him staring once. Their eyes met across the fence. Merrick looked away first. On the 7th morning after planting, Therek found something left near his well. A sack. Small. Rough-spun cloth tied tight at the top. He approached cautiously, scanning the road before kneeling beside it. Inside were potatoes. Not many, but fresh. He did not smile. He did not look toward the village. He simply nodded once, a silent acknowledgement, and carried the sack inside the farmhouse. That afternoon, he left something near the road in return. 2 bundles of split firewood stacked neatly against the broken fence post nearest the path. No note. No words. The exchange repeated itself 3 days later. More potatoes. More wood. Still no names attached. Fear often begins to soften before pride does. By mid-spring, the barn frame stood upright again. Therek had reinforced the beams and repaired one stall. He found an old plow rusting beneath debris and spent 2 evenings sanding its edge smooth enough to cut shallow furrows. He did not own livestock, but he prepared for the possibility. One evening, as he hauled a beam into place, he heard footsteps behind him. He turned slowly. A woman stood at the edge of the property line. Human, mid-30s. Widow's black band tied at her sleeve. 2 thin children lingered behind her. I'm not trespassing, she said quickly. Therek set the beam down carefully. No, he replied. His voice was deep, steady, not threatening. She swallowed, glancing toward the barn. You made that roof stronger than it was before, she said. Yes. She hesitated. My husband died in the war, she added quietly. I am sorry, Therek replied. She studied his face, searching for mockery. There was none. The mill raised prices again, she continued. My field failed last season. Therek waited. She glanced toward the green rows stretching behind him. It grows, she said. Yes. Silence stretched thin between them. I can sew, she added. And mend nets. And patch roofs. He understood. Not charity. Trade. You help repair western fence, he said slowly. I give barley when ready. She nodded once. The children stepped closer, peeking around her skirts at the towering orc farmer. He did not crouch. He did not loom. He simply returned to lifting the beam, and the woman stepped into the yard to assist. By dusk, the western fence stood straighter than before. When she left, the children carried small bundles of kindling under their arms. From the road, a few villagers watched the exchange carefully. Suspicion did not vanish, but it cracked. The seeds in the ash were not just barley. They were something more fragile. Trust, planted carefully. And Therek, who had crossed a border without permission and claimed no banner, worked the soil not to conquer it, but to prove it could still feed more than fear. By early summer, the field no longer looked abandoned. The barley rose thick and gold, bending in soft waves when wind rolled across the valley. Where ash had once clung to cracked soil, now rows stood orderly and alive. Even those who had sworn the land was cursed could no longer deny what they saw from the road. It had grown, and it had grown well. Therek worked from dawn until the sun burned high overhead, testing the heads of grain between his calloused fingers. He did not rush harvest. Grain cut too early meant hunger later. Grain cut too late meant waste. He waited for the right moment. The widow, Elira, he had learned, returned almost daily now. Her children ran through the outer yard freely, though they never crossed the inner threshold without invitation. They had stopped staring at his tusks. They asked him questions instead. "Did your land have wheat like this?" the boy asked once. "Yes," Therek replied. "Is it still there?" "No." He did not elaborate. Elira noticed the way his voice changed when he answered that. On the morning harvest began, 3 more villagers arrived unannounced. Jorin the miller, old Merrick, and a young farmhand named Tomas who had lost half his crop to blight the previous season. They stood awkwardly at the fence line until Therek looked up from sharpening his sickle. "We can help," Jorin said stiffly. Therek studied them for a long moment. "Harvest is heavy work," he replied. "We know," Merrick muttered. Elira stepped forward first and began tying grain bundles without waiting for permission. That decided it. By mid-morning, 7 people worked the field. By midday, 12. No speeches were made. No agreements signed. No official recognition declared. Just hands cutting grain in steady rhythm. Sweat ran freely. Laughter even surfaced once when Tomas misjudged his swing and nearly toppled into a row. Therek caught him by the collar without comment and set him upright again. The field did not feel like territory that day. It felt like survival shared. By sunset, half the crop lay bundled and stacked. Therek insisted on dividing the grain openly. "Equal share to those who cut," he said simply. "No," Merrick protested. "You planted it." "We planted," Elira corrected. Therek nodded. "Land was empty," he said. "Now it feeds." There was no arguing with that. That evening, smoke rose from more chimneys than usual in Harrowfield. Bread baked from the first fresh grain in years. It tasted different. Sweeter, some said. Heavier, others insisted. But no one called it cursed. Word traveled beyond the village within days. A trader passing through mentioned an orc farmer near the border whose fields outperformed human farms abandoned since the war. The story reached neighboring settlements before the week ended. Not all reactions were warm. "Today he farms," one neighboring lord reportedly scoffed. "Tomorrow he claims territory." Rumors travel faster than harvest wagons. But in Harrowfield, something undeniable had occurred. Children were eating full meals. Elira paid her mill debt. Tomas purchased new seed for his own land. And the once blackened field stood as proof that neglect, not curse, had kept it barren. On the final evening of harvest, as the last wagon rolled toward the village granary, Therek remained behind alone. He walked the field slowly, fingers brushing the stubble left behind. The soil was no longer silent. It had been turned, tested, shared. He knew attention would come. Success draws notice as surely as invasion does. He had crossed a border without permission. He had worked land not legally granted. He understood kingdoms value law more than labor. But as he looked over the empty field beneath a fading orange sky, he did not regret planting the first seed. Because hunger does not ask for citizenship, and land does not care whose hands turn it. Only that someone does. The letter arrived with a seal. Red wax, stamped with the crest of the crown of Vale Dorn, a lion gripping a sword. No one in Harrowfield had seen that seal in years. The rider wore polished armor, not the weathered steel of border patrol. 2 mounted guards followed behind him, banners tied to their saddles despite the quiet road. They did not ride past the village. They rode straight to the ruined farm that was no longer ruined. Therek was repairing a cart axle when he saw them crest the hill. He did not reach for a weapon. He did not have one. He wiped his hands clean on a cloth and stepped into the yard. Elira saw the riders too and froze where she stood near the well. By the time the horses stopped at the outer fence, half the village had gathered at a cautious distance along the road. The lead officer dismounted slowly. He removed his helmet. His expression was not cruel. It was official. "Who claims this land?" he asked loudly. Therek stepped forward. "I work it." "That was not my question," the officer replied. Therek held his gaze. "I do." Murmurs rippled behind the fence line. The officer produced a scroll and broke the wax seal deliberately. "By decree of His Majesty King Auron IV," he read, voice carrying clearly. "Any foreign national occupying borderland without royal charter or permit shall be considered in violation of sovereign territory law." The words felt heavy in the still air. Such individuals are to surrender property in person for processing and review by the Crown. Processing. The word chilled the gathered villagers more than arrest would have. The officer lowered the scroll. Name, he demanded. Therek. Clan affiliation? None. The officer's brow twitched slightly at that. You entered the kingdom unlawfully. Yes. You claimed land without title. It was abandoned. It was not relinquished, the officer corrected sharply. It remains crown territory. Therek did not argue the technicality. He understood law. Law did not ask whether fields were starving, only who owned them. Elira stepped forward suddenly. It fed us, she said. The officer glanced at her. This is not your concern. It is, she insisted. We worked it. The officer's gaze hardened slightly. You knowingly assisted a legal occupation? Silence fell over the villagers. No one stepped back. Merrick cleared his throat. It wasn't occupied, he muttered. It was rotting. The officer ignored him. He turned back to Therek. You will surrender yourself to the crown's authority. Therek nodded once. I will not resist. A visible exhale passed through the officer. But then Therek added, I will not abandon the field. The officer stiffened. That is not negotiable. Harvest is stored, Therek replied calmly. Winter comes. Families rely on it. The crown will determine redistribution. Murmurs grew sharper at that. Redistribution meant taxes. Seizure. Delay. Elira's hands clenched. You'll let it spoil in paperwork, she snapped. The officer's jaw tightened. You speak dangerously. I speak hungry, she shot back. The two guards shifted in their saddles, hands resting lightly near sword hilts. Therek stepped slightly forward. Take me, he said. After next planting. That is not your decision. Let crop finish. Therek continued evenly. Then I go. The officer studied him carefully. You believe you have leverage? No, Therek replied. I believe the land does. Silence stretched. Behind the officer, the golden field shimmered in late afternoon light. Undeniable evidence of what had been built. The officer rolled the scroll, closed slowly. You are ordered to present yourself for custody at first light tomorrow. He glanced toward the village. Interference will be treated as obstruction of royal authority. The warning was clear. The rider mounted his horse. As they turned back toward the road, the villagers did not disperse. They stood in the yard, uncertain, angry, afraid. Elira looked at Therek. You'll run, she whispered. No. They'll chain you. Yes. You trust them? No. Silence lingered. Therek looked out over the field once more. The barley had been cut. The soil rested. I crossed a border, he said quietly. I knew there would be reckoning. Merrick stepped closer. You worked that land better than any of us, he muttered. Doesn't matter, Jorin said grimly. To the crown, he's still an orc. The sun dipped lower, casting long shadows across the yard. The decree had been delivered. The kingdom had noticed. And at dawn, law would arrive, whether justice stood with it or not. Dawn came cold, not with frost, but with the kind of chill that settles into the chest when something inevitable approaches. Therek was already awake when the first light broke across the field. He stood in the yard facing east, hands clasped behind his back, watching mist rise in thin sheets from the freshly cut soil. The farm was quiet. Too quiet. He had stacked the remaining grain neatly beneath tarp beams inside the repaired barn. Tools were cleaned and lined against the wall. The well bucket was full. If he was to leave, he would not leave disorder behind. Hoofbeats carried faintly from the road before the sun cleared the ridge. This time, there were more of them. 6 mounted guards, 2 on foot, and the same officer at their head. They did not wait at the fence. They entered the yard directly. Therek did not move. Elira stood near the farmhouse door, pale but unyielding. Tomas lingered near the barn. Merrick and Jorin stood by the road, joined by others who had risen early and walked the path in silence. The officer dismounted. You were ordered to present yourself, he said evenly. I am here, Therek replied. The officer nodded once. You will come with us. Therek inclined his head slightly. I will. He did not reach for anything. He did not argue, but he did not step forward either. The officer studied him. Is there complication? He asked. Yes, Therek said calmly. The word rippled through the yard. The winter planting begins tomorrow, Therek continued. Field must be turned again. That is not your concern anymore. It is theirs, Therek said, glancing briefly toward the gathered villagers. The officer followed his gaze. You believe that gives you leverage? No. Then what is this? Time, Therek answered simply. The officer's jaw tightened. You stand on crown land without charter. You admit unlawful entry. You refuse compliance with direct order. I refuse abandonment, Therek corrected. The guards shifted uneasily. Elira stepped forward suddenly. He fed us, she said sharply. The officer did not look at her. This is not debate. You'll take him, she demanded. After he rebuilt what you left to rot. A murmur of agreement rose from the villagers. The officer's voice hardened. Stand back. No one moved. Tomas stepped forward beside Elira. He didn't steal the land, he said. He repaired it. It was not relinquished, the officer replied. It was forgotten, Merrick called out. The guards placed hands on sword hilts now. The tension sharpened. Therek lifted one large hand slightly. Do not, he said quietly. The villagers fell silent. He stepped forward slowly toward the officer. I will go, he repeated. But grain stays. The grain belongs to the crown. No, Elira said. It belongs to winter. The officer's patience thinned visibly. You obstruct royal order, he warned. No, Jorin said carefully. We stand on our own property. The statement hung deliberately vague. The yard filled further. More villagers had arrived. No weapons drawn. No raised fists. Just bodies. Forming. Not aggressively, but undeniably. The officer scanned the growing line of men and women standing shoulder to shoulder behind Therek. You threaten insurrection? He asked coldly. No, Merrick answered. We protect harvest. The guards unsheathed blades halfway. Metal glinted in early sunlight. Therek's voice cut through the tension. If blood spills here, he said evenly, it proves your fear correct. The officer's eyes narrowed. And what fear is that? That orcs bring violence. Silence. Therek lowered his head slightly. I crossed border without permission, he said. That is truth. But I worked land no one claimed. You cannot decide that. Neither can hunger, Therek replied. The standoff stretched thin. Wind brushed across the cut field behind them. The officer looked at the villagers again, at Elira's defiance. Tomas' clenched jaw, Marek's weathered glare. No torches. No weapons. Just refusal to step aside. You understand, the officer said slowly. This becomes larger than a farm. It already is, Elira answered. The officer exhaled sharply through his nose. You will be summoned before a regional magistrate, he said at last. You will answer for unlawful entry and occupation. And the field? Therek asked. It remains under provisional crown review, the officer replied. Meaning? Meaning we do not seize it today. A subtle wave of relief moved through the villagers. The officer stepped closer to Therek. You will present yourself in 3 days, he said quietly. If you fail, we return with warrant. I will come, Therek answered. The officer remounted his horse. As the guards withdrew from the yard, tension did not dissolve entirely. But steel was sheathed. No chains were used. No blood touched soil. When the riders disappeared over the ridge, the villagers remained standing for several long breaths. Elira turned to Therek. You could have run, she said. Yes. You could have fought. Yes. Why didn't you? Therek looked toward the field. Because land grows better without fear. The kingdom had tried to arrest him. The village had stood. And now, the battle would move from field to law. The village did not disperse immediately after the soldiers left. They lingered in the yard as if expecting the riders to crest the hill again at any moment. Fear does not vanish simply because steel returns to its sheath. It settles into quiet corners and waits. Therek bent to lift the cart axle he had been repairing before dawn. Work resumed. That was how Harrifield handled uncertainty. Merrick cleared his throat awkwardly. 3 days, he muttered. You really going? Yes, Therek replied. You trust them? Tomas asked. No. Elira stepped closer. Then why go at all? Therek tightened the axle bolt slowly before answering. Because if I do not, they return with chains. And if they return with chains, someone here will resist. He glanced at the gathered villagers. And then it becomes proof, he finished. Proof of what? Merrick demanded. That we cannot live beside each other. The words hung heavily. They all understood the trap. If Therek fled, the crown would call him fugitive invader. If the village resisted arrest, they would call it rebellion. If violence broke out, it would confirm every fear whispered in court halls far from this soil. The field had grown grain. Now it grew consequence. That afternoon, the village met in the square for the first time in years without a funeral to justify it. No banners. No formal council. Just farmers with dirt still under their nails. Jorin spoke first. They'll try to make this about border law. It is border law, someone muttered. It's also about who's allowed to belong, Elira countered. Murmurs followed. An older man at the back shook his head. He's still an orc. Yes, Elira said firmly. And he still fed your grandchildren. Silence. The truth had weight. Therek stood slightly apart from the circle, listening without inserting himself. He understood something they were only beginning to confront. This was no longer about him alone. It was about precedent. If the crown removed him successfully, abandoned land would remain abandoned. If the crown allowed him to stay, other displaced people might follow. The kingdom feared patterns more than individuals. As the sun lowered, a plan formed. Not rebellion, not protest. Testimony. They would go with him. Not all, but enough. Elira volunteered first. Merrick followed with a gruff nod. Tomas raised his hand without hesitation. The magistrate must see faces, Elira said. Not just a green one. A few uneasy chuckles broke tension. Therek finally stepped forward. You owe me nothing, he said quietly. You rebuilt our winter, Merrick replied. That counts. It was trade, Therek corrected. No, Elira said. It was choice. The distinction mattered. By dusk, word had spread beyond Harrowfield. 2 neighboring farmers who had quietly purchased surplus grain during harvest sent messages offering statements of support. Not loud endorsements, but enough to suggest this issue was no longer isolated. Inside the farmhouse that night, Therek sat at the small wooden table he had rebuilt from charred beams. He had crossed the border expecting solitude. He had found community. That frightened him more than arrest. Community meant vulnerability. If he failed before the magistrate, the village's quiet stand would be remembered. If he succeeded, the crown would be forced to consider something it had not planned for. An orc who did not raid, who did not demand, who simply worked. He flexed his hands slowly. These hands had once carried weapons. Now they carried soil. He did not regret the change. Outside, the field lay bare but ready. Winter planting would begin in 2 days, whether he stood in it or not. Before sleeping, Therek stepped outside once more. The night air was calm. From the village, faint lamplight flickered in windows. He knew some of them were awake, talking in low voices about law, about borders, about risk. He had crossed into the kingdom without permission. That was truth. But the land had not rejected him. And neither, it seemed, had the people who lived upon it. 3 days remained. Then the argument would leave the soil and enter stone halls. And in those halls, law would speak loudly. But for the first time, it would not speak unchallenged. The morning of departure came without ceremony. No bells rang. No banners waved. The sky hung low and gray above Harrowfield, heavy with the promise of late-season rain. Therek stood at the edge of the field one last time before leaving, boots pressed into soil he had turned with his own hands. Winter planting should have begun that day. Instead, the field waited. Elira approached first, cloak pulled tight against the chill. Tomas followed with a satchel slung over his shoulder. Merrick arrived last, grumbling about stiff knees but refusing to stay behind. Behind them came more. Not dozens, not a mob, but enough. 8 villagers in total would walk with Therek to the regional magistrate's hall in Briarhold. They carried no weapons, only statements written in rough ink on borrowed parchment. As they began down the road, the repaired farmhouse stood quiet behind them. Smoke did not rise from its chimney that morning. The land would rest. Halfway to Briarhold, hoofbeats sounded again. The same royal officer who had delivered the decree rode out from a tree line with 4 guards. He raised a hand. They halted. You intend to comply, the officer said, noting the group. Yes, Therek answered. The officer's gaze moved over the villagers. You bring witnesses. We bring truth, Elira replied before she could stop herself. The officer studied her carefully. You understand this hearing concerns violation of sovereign law, he said. Not agricultural performance. Law should see consequence, Merrick muttered. The officer did not argue. He turned his horse and fell in alongside them, escort rather than enforcer. That subtle shift did not go unnoticed. By midday, Briarhold's stone towers rose ahead, gray and imposing against the horizon. Unlike Harrowfield's wood and soil, this was a place of record and decree, of seals and statutes, of decisions made far from fields. As they approached the gate, whispers began among city folk. Orc Refugee. Border case. Word had traveled ahead of them. Inside the magistrate's hall, the air smelled of ink and cold stone. Tall windows filtered thin light across polished floors. Guards lined the walls, hands resting on pommels, not raised, but ready. Magistrate Halwyn sat elevated behind a carved wooden bench. His robes were dark blue, trimmed in silver thread marking his authority. He did not look surprised. Therek of no declared clan. Halwyn began, reading from parchment, charged with unlawful border entry and unauthorized occupation of Crown land. Therek stepped forward alone. Yes. The single word echoed clearly. You admit entry without permit? Yes. You admit cultivation of land not legally granted to you? Yes. Murmurs spread softly through the hall. The magistrate folded his hands. Then this should be brief. Elira stepped forward without waiting to be called. No. Gasps followed. The guards shifted slightly. Magistrate Halwyn raised a brow. You are Elira of Hereford. You are not the accused. No, she said firmly. But we are the consequence. The magistrate studied her. Proceed. She swallowed once, then spoke. That land was ash for 11 years. No taxes collected. No crops grown. No families fed. He turned it into harvest. Merrick stepped forward next. We worked it too. Tomas followed. My younger sisters ate because of it. One by one, the villagers stepped into view. Not loudly, not angrily, just present. The magistrate listened, expression unreadable. This court does not evaluate kindness, he said carefully. It evaluates law. Then evaluate the law fully, Elira replied. Does the crown prefer empty soil to full granaries? A stir moved through the gathered observers. Halwyn leaned back slightly. You challenge sovereign ownership? No, she said. We challenge neglect. Silence thickened. Therek spoke then, voice steady. I crossed border without permission, he said. I accept penalty. The villagers turned sharply toward him. But land fed people, he continued. If that is crime, I stand guilty. The magistrate's fingers tapped lightly against polished wood. And if every displaced soul claimed abandoned land, he asked. Then perhaps, Therek answered quietly, less land would be abandoned. The hall fell silent. Law stood on one side. Soil stood on the other. And for the first time in that chamber's memory, an Orc refugee did not argue innocence. He argued value. The magistrate exhaled slowly. This hearing is not concluded, he said. Return tomorrow. I will review statute. The villagers stepped back as guards escorted them from the hall. Outside, Briarhold buzzed with whispers. They had not been dismissed. They had not been jailed. The line had not broken. It had been drawn, not with weapons, but with witness. And in that stand, quiet, unarmed, undeniable, the kingdom's law faced something it rarely encountered. People willing to defend what was right, without raising a single blade. They were not jailed. That alone unsettled Briarhold more than chains would have. Word spread through the market before the villagers even reached their lodging. An orc had stood in the magistrate's hall and admitted guilt without begging for mercy. Farmers had spoken against neglect. The magistrate had not issued immediate judgment. Uncertainty travels faster than outrage. By evening, scribes were copying notes from the hearing. Merchants debated it openly near the fountain. A courier had already ridden for the capital with summary of the case. Border refugee claims abandoned land. Village testifies in support. Magistrate reviewing statute. The crown did not like surprises. Inside a rented stable loft, Therek sat on a bale of hay while Elira paced. You shouldn't have said you accept penalty, she muttered. It is truth, he replied. They'll use that. They would use denial too. She stopped pacing. You speak like you've stood in halls like that before. I have stood before war chiefs, Therek said quietly. They are louder. Merrick leaned against a post, arms folded. What do you think the magistrate's doing now? Tomas asked. Looking for precedent, Jorin answered grimly. And there was little. Border law had been written after the war, strict, preventative, designed to stop encroachment before it began. It did not account for cooperation. It did not account for abandoned land restored. It certainly did not account for villages defending orcs. Across town, in a chamber lit by oil lamps, Magistrate Halwyn sat surrounded by books older than the war itself. He had removed his robe and unrolled statutes line by line. Unlawful entry. Clear. Unauthorized occupation. Clear. But then, Abandoned crown property may be reclaimed under petition if productivity restored and tax obligations fulfilled. The clause was ancient, rarely used, nearly forgotten. It required proof, witness, and willingness of local township to accept shared obligation. Halwyn leaned back slowly. The law had never anticipated this exact situation, but it had left space. Outside the courthouse, crowds gathered by nightfall. Some shouted, "Send him back." Others countered, "He grows food." Rumor magnified everything. By lantern light, Therek's field had become myth, either a symbol of invasion or proof of renewal, depending on who told the tale. A city guard approached the stable loft door after dark. "You are not under arrest," he said to Therek, voice measured. "But you are not to leave Briarhold." "I will not," Therek replied. The guard hesitated before adding quietly, "There are those in the capital who are watching." "Watching what?" Elira asked. "To see whether this becomes a problem," the guard said. Therek nodded once. It already had. In the capital, advisors whispered around polished tables. If Herefield's case succeeded, other border settlements might petition similarly. Refugees might seek restoration instead of removal. The Crown's tight control of territory could loosen. Control was stability, but so was food. The next morning, Briarhold Square filled before the hearing resumed. Not violently. Curiously, Therek walked through the crowd without escort, villagers flanking him quietly. Some spat near his boots. Others nodded. Most simply stared. The kingdom was watching. Not just the magistrate, not just the crown, but the people. Because what happened in that hall would signal something larger than one farm. It would signal whether law was a movable stone, or whether it could bend without breaking. As the great doors opened once more, Magistrate Halwyn took his seat. He looked tired and thoughtful. "The court has reviewed applicable statutes," he began. The murmuring crowd outside fell silent. Inside, the villagers stood behind Therek once again. The magistrate's eyes met the orcs directly. "This matter concerns more than unlawful entry," he said slowly. "It concerns whether restoration constitutes claim." A single breath seemed to hold the entire hall. The kingdom was watching. And for the first time, it was not watching a raid or a rebellion, but a field, and the question of who is allowed to grow in it. The hall was fuller than the day before. Word had spread beyond Briarhold. Merchants delayed departures. Farmers from neighboring settlements filled the back rows. Even minor nobles stood along the walls, curious to see how far this border case would ripple. Magistrate Halwyn adjusted the stack of parchment before him and let the silence settle properly. "This court recognizes," he began, "that the accused has admitted unlawful entry into the kingdom." A murmur passed through the chamber. Therek stood straight, hands at his sides. "But," Halwyn continued, "this court must also consider Statute 47C of the Post-War Restoration Charter." That drew attention. Few in the room knew the code by number. Elira of Herefield. The magistrate said, "Step forward." She did. "You testified that the land in question has been unworked for 11 years. Yes. Did the Crown collect taxes on it during that period? No. Did any citizen petition to restore it? No." Halwyn nodded once. To the accused, "Therek, step forward." Therek did. "You admit you did not petition the Crown before cultivating?" "Yes." "Were you aware such petition was possible?" "No." "Would you have filed one?" "Yes." The answer came without hesitation. Halwyn studied him carefully. "You restored productivity to abandoned land." "Yes." "You distributed grain to residents of Herefield." "Yes." "You did not fortify, arm, or claim sovereignty." "No." The magistrate's voice sharpened slightly. "Did you at any point declare the land independent of the Crown?" "No." Silence followed. Halwyn folded his hands. "The Crown argues that unlawful entry cannot be rewarded." A few murmurs of agreement echoed. "Elira," he said, turning, "if this court removes him, what happens to the land?" "It goes back to rot," she answered plainly. "And if allowed to remain, it feeds us." The simplicity cut through rhetoric. One of the Crown's appointed advocates stepped forward then, a narrow-faced man in deep burgundy robes. "Your Honor," he began, "if we allow foreign nationals to occupy abandoned territory without consequence, we create precedent encouraging border instability." Halwyn inclined his head slightly. "Precedent cuts both ways," he replied. The advocate continued, "The kingdom must enforce law evenly. And does even enforcement include neglect? Halwyn asked quietly. A ripple moved through the chamber. The advocate hesitated. No. Halwyn turned back to Therek. You stand willing to accept penalty for unlawful entry? Yes. Even if that penalty includes removal? Therek paused only briefly. Yes. Elira stiffened behind him. Merrick muttered under his breath. Halwyn watched the exchange closely. You accept removal, knowing the land may fail again? Yes. Why? Therek lifted his eyes to meet the magistrate's. Because I crossed border without permission, he said calmly. But I did not cross to take. I crossed to work. The hall fell still. Would you submit to taxation? Yes. Would you swear loyalty to the crown while residing on its soil? Yes. Would you agree to formal petition for conditional stewardship? Yes. The answers did not waver. Halwyn leaned back slowly. Statute 47C allows restoration claim if land has been demonstrably reclaimed, if local township affirms benefit, and if claimant submits to taxation and crown authority. He looked over the crowd. Does Harrowfield affirm benefit? One by one, villagers raised their hands. Not all, but enough. Halwyn exhaled quietly. The law does not favor unlawful entry, he said, but neither does it favor wasted resource. The Crown advocate stiffened. Your Honor. Halwyn raised a hand. The accused will be fined for unlawful border crossing. A murmur surged. He will file immediate petition for conditional stewardship under Crown authority. Elira gripped Tomas' arm. Failure to comply with taxation or oath will result in removal. Silence held. And, Halwyn finished, this ruling applies solely to the land restored in Harrowfield under verified testimony. The hall remained quiet for 2 heartbeats. Then sound returned, not cheering, not outrage, just collective release. Therek bowed his head slightly. Thank you. The magistrate's gaze lingered on him. This is not mercy, Halwyn said. It is statute. Yes, Therek replied. As they stepped outside into Briarhold Square, the air felt lighter. The kingdom had not embraced him, but it had not erased him. The law had bent, not broken. And for the first time since crossing the border, Therek was not simply a refugee. He was something more complicated. Recognized. They returned to Harrowfield without escort. No chains. No banners. Just a small group walking the same road they had taken 3 days before, but with something invisible shifted. Word had reached the village ahead of them. By the time Therek crested the final hill overlooking the once-burned farm, people were already gathered near the fence line. No celebration. No shouting. Just presence. Elira's children ran first, skidding to a halt only when they remembered themselves and slowed to something more dignified. Merrick removed his cap. Tomas clapped Therek's shoulder once, awkward but firm. Well, Merrick muttered, looks like you owe taxes now. A faint rumble of amusement moved through the crowd. Yes, Therek replied. I do. The farmhouse stood as he had left it. The field lay bare, but ready, waiting for winter planting. The sky hung wide and open above soil that had once been ash. Elira stepped beside him. You're staying, she said quietly. Yes. Not as trespasser. No. Not as invader. No. He looked down at his hands. As steward, he said. The word felt heavier than ownership. That evening, the entire village gathered in the field itself. No formal speeches were made, but the symbolism did not go unnoticed. Lanterns were placed along the fence posts Therek had first repaired. The well bucket passed from hand to hand. Bread baked from the last of the summer grain was broken and shared. No one called it a victory, because it wasn't. It was permission, conditional, fragile, but real. Over the next weeks, paperwork was filed, taxes calculated, an oath sworn in Briarhold under witness. Therek stood straight in that hall again, repeating words that bound him not by fear, but by agreement. He did not renounce who he was. He did not deny where he came from. He simply pledged to protect the land he worked and abide by the laws of the soil he now stood upon. That mattered. Winter planting began under gray skies and steady breath. This time, Therek did not work alone at the edge of the field while villagers watched from a distance. They worked beside him openly. Jorin brought improved seed grain. Tomas repaired irrigation trenches. Merrick argued loudly about spacing rows, but followed Therek's measurements anyway. Children ran between furrows, laughter scattering like sparrows over fresh-turned earth. Months later, When snow fell and Herefield's chimneys smoked thick against the cold, no one went hungry. And when spring returned, something unexpected happened. Two displaced families, human refugees from a southern drought, petitioned the crown for similar restoration rights on abandoned land beyond the ridge. The magistrate approved review, not because of sentiment, because precedent had been written. Years passed. The once burned farm expanded into cooperative fields. Shared storage barns rose where ash piles had once sat. Taxes were paid on time. Harvests recorded properly. Briarhold's officials stopped sending riders except during routine inspection. The word orc did not disappear from conversations, but it changed tone, not threat. Neighbor. One evening, standing at the edge of a golden field once more, Elira looked at Therek and said, "Funny thing." "What?" he asked. "We thought you chose this land." He looked across the valley. The fences he'd repaired were stronger now. The farmhouse roof stood solid. Children chased each other between rows of barley taller than their heads. "No," he said quietly. "The land chose to grow. And in growing, it had chosen him too." The kingdom had tried to arrest an Orc refugee. Instead, it had gained a steward. And Herefield learned something that law alone could not teach. Belonging is not declared by decree. It is earned by what you build, and who stands with you while you build it.